think, oh, well, of course, this will be a movie, right? Someone's going to turn this into a movie. It was just this kind of amazing thing that happened by chance. And it was really wonderful. I got to meet with her in Nashville, and I loved her thoughts on the book. And then little by little, it started to happen. They found a wonderful screenwriter. Jason Bateman was going to direct it and star in it. And we got to go watch them film it. And it was all just like a dream beyond what I could have ever expected.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I actually heard somewhere that you came back to writing the story of the Family Fang from a short story that you had written, and you didn't really feel like you could take it off somewhere and have it grow into what you wanted it to be. And so how did that, in combination with your being a new father and being an artist and a writer, how did that blend together? And also, do you ever find yourself coming back to stories that you've started and continuing working on them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's true. Family Fang came from a little short story that I could never quite figure out. And just one of the things with me is that I may not be the best writer or technically the most brilliant, but I'm pretty tenacious. Like, I just don't give up. And so when a story's not working, I tend to let it sit and come back to it maybe a couple of years later and figure out maybe I'm the writer that can do it now. And with this story, it was just I was probably just a couple of years out of college, but I wrote about a brother and sister who have to be in this very small town, Romeo and Juliet, in the high school play. And I wrote it, and it was kind of silly because, they have to kiss and they're romantic. And then in my head, as I got older and we had this kid, I was like, what kind of parents would let their children do that? And I was like, oh, artists, performance artists. And
Mm-hmm.
once I figured that out, I could go back into that story and make it bigger and bigger and build around them once I knew that was what it was. But for me, I try to never let go of an idea. I just wait for that moment that I know I can come back to it and make it what it needs to be. There's a lot of times where I'm writing something and I'm like, if I were a better writer, I could make this work, but I'm not there yet. So I leave it, I let it sit, and I hope someday I'll be able to come back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good answer. So I guess another question I have about the Family Fang is that there's a very strong presence of the definition of family and the theme of family and how these kids grow up in an unconventional family, but it's a family nonetheless. And we see the theme of family throughout your other works, like in your most recent book, Nothing to See Here, and in your other book, Perfect Little World, is about a woman who has to raise a child, right, in a kind of communal family. And so what I'm wondering is, why are so many of your books about the theme of family? And kind of why do you, or where does the inspiration come for you to change the definition and allow the reader to reflect on their own definition of family?
That's great. Yeah, I mean, all I write about is family. It's the thing that I think I'll always write about because it's constantly evolving for me. So when I was younger, I started writing as a teenager. Why I wanted to write about family was because I wanted to understand, like, how did I appear in this world, and who are these people that were supposed to protect me, and they did, and take care of me. But what's that weird moment when you have to leave that family for a moment to decide who you're going to become? And so when I was younger, that's what I really loved writing about. And then as I got older, that idea of family changed, which is, why do you bring someone into this world? What can you offer them? How do you keep them safe? And I just don't think I ever stopped thinking about that. And when I think of family, it's not just the people that made you or the people that you make. It's all the ways that that idea of family evolves and gets bigger to take in the people that mean something to you. I think I write about family because I don't really know why we're on this earth. It's a mystery to me. And so, in the absence of what I think of as definitive proof of why I'm here, the only thing I can figure is that I'm supposed to take care of other people, to protect them so that we can all get safely to whatever comes next. And that's family to me. It's a bunch of people taking care of each other to figure out what comes next. And why do I write about it? Well, I think, and this is a weird thing to maybe bring up, but when I was just out of college, I met the writer Ann Patchett, and we became friends. And I became her dog sitter, and I would take care of her dog in Nashville while she was on book tour. And I was a fan of her work even before that. And one of the things that resonated me with Ann Patchett's work was she always writes about these strange families, the way people come together under uncertain circumstances. And when I saw another writer doing that, I was like, oh, you can write about this. You can write about the strangeness of family. Why are we here? Who made us? And I just keep coming back to it. I don't think I'll ever stop writing about it.
Hmm. That's really interesting that you kind of are able to make sense of what the meaning of life is through family and incorporate that into your writing. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's really cool. Um, so other than family, another recurring topic in some of your books are magical or fantastical themes like spontaneous combustion or time travel. And in your most recent book, Nothing to See Here, which came out in 2019, the main character Lillian has to nanny these two kids who spontaneously combust whenever they become upset.
Yeah.
And I read this book and I really liked it because it was so different and it was lighthearted, but it also, like your other works, had this theme of family that made the characters and myself as a reader, and I'm sure everyone else who reads it, it made us look at and assess our own definition of family. But to come back to that idea of the quirky, spontaneous combustion, why did you choose to write about spontaneous combustion in this work and also in several of your other works? And where does the inspiration for such an idea come from?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think the first thing I'll say is like the reason that I write a lot of my stories have magic or weirdness or is because growing up, what I read were fairy tales and comic books and fantasy novels, and I loved the magic of those worlds. Right, I loved the unpredictability of fairy tales, and that's just what I grew up reading. So when it came time for me to write, no one was telling me not to do that. So I just thought, I'm going to put weirdness in my stories. I'm going to put magic in there and see what happens. Um, and then the larger answer is like, for instance, like spontaneous human combustion, which I've put in 3 different books. Um, this goes back to something maybe a little more difficult, which is just that, since I was probably 12, I have like recurring images that flash in my brain of bad thoughts. They just come all the time. And when I was an adult, finally, I was diagnosed with Tourette's, and a lot of that I have tics and kind of strange movements, and that kind of unlocked some things for me. And I was like, why do I keep coming back to these weird images of bursting into flames? Why am I afraid that I'm going to burst into flames? And as a teenager, dealing with mental health issues, one, I kind of wanted to burst into flames. Like I was like, oh, it would be so great if I could just catch on fire and burn out everything that's inside of me that's making me feel this way. And I just kind of always kept that in my head of that I might catch on fire. And then the reason that I wrote this book about spontaneous human combustion was that when my oldest son was born, when he was around 2, he started showing tics and exhibiting those same traits. And it became this interesting thing for me where I was like, oh my God, that's me. I did this. And in my head, I thought, I figured out how to take care of myself if I burst into flames, but how do I protect somebody that I love when they burst into flames? And that became Nothing to See Here. I really just wanted to know, how do you protect fire children? Because I was trying to figure that out in my own life with the people that I loved. These books are weird and strange, but at the heart of them, usually there's some piece of me that I'm trying to figure out. I'm placing this part of me inside the novel and hoping that I can kind of write my way towards an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened with Nothing to See Here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it definitely sounds like you put some of yourself into Lillian, the main character, and as well as all the other adult characters who kind of have to figure out how to deal with these kids who burst into flame every time they become upset. And so do you ever find yourself incorporating parts of your own life or your own personality into your books as directly as you do with Lillian?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do it a lot, and what's interesting is, I'm pretty good about hiding it, right? So that I don't think people can tell, but a lot of times, a lot of stories that I write or novels that I write, I'm trying to work out something that's happened to me or something that I'm thinking about, and that also might be a reason why a lot of my novels, the main character is usually a female character, because in some ways I'm trying to hide myself inside of that book, right? And um, so like Lillian really is in so many ways, like the way that we talk, the way that she thinks is very similar to me.
Mhm.
Um, and I was just trying to kind of figure out how do I create a compelling character, but there's still these parts of me that are in that story. But I don't even know that anyone could see them. I don't know that my parents would recognize me in the books that I've written.
Mhm. So it's kind of like a disguise,
Yeah, I'm
right?
hiding myself in the story, so that I'm getting something out of it, but I don't want the reader to be overwhelmed thinking, "Oh, this is Kevin," or "This is his own personal story." That's why I write fiction, so I
Mhm.
hide it, so that the reader can concentrate on the story at hand, but I'm getting something out of it as I write it.
Mhm. Cool. So you are not only an author, but you're also a college professor, a husband, and a father. And so when do you find time to write? And what does your writing process usually look like when you get an idea and you decide that you have to write about it, be it a short story or a full novel?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because when I was, I mean, pretty close to your age, I saw this writer come to town. I was in Nashville, and someone asked, like, how do you make it as a writer? And he said, well, every day you need to get up and put on a suit and a tie and get your briefcase, and you walk out the door, and then you walk back in and you sit at your desk and you write all day long.
Yeah.
And I was like 19, and I thought, oh, that sounds terrible. Like, I don't think I'm going to be a writer then. Um, and for a long time, I felt really guilty that that wasn't how I worked. But I've figured out how I write, and I feel like everybody has their own thing. And for me, it's that I don't write every day. I don't write every week. There's lots of times where I'm overwhelmed, or my kids want me to play with them, and they just aren't jazzed if I'm like, well, I got to go write a novel. Sorry, they want me to play with them, so I play with them, and I don't worry about it. And I used to feel so guilty, like I'm not a real writer, I don't write all the time. But what I've realized is so much of it for me is that I write in my head all the time. Like when my boys and I go on a walk, I'm just in my head thinking about that story that I want to tell. And a lot of times that's become really helpful for me, is that I don't write every day. So I'm telling the story to myself over and over and over again, waiting for that chance to sit down. And by the time I sit down, I've thought about it for so long that it goes really fast. I'm ready. And I've actually even thought about what the first paragraph or page even looks like. I've kind of memorized it in my head. Um, so for me, it's everyone figures out how they write, and everyone is a writer. If you write, you're a writer. And so I've I've I feel less and less worried about that. I come to it when I'm ready, and I just hope that it'll let me go where I want to go when I sit down.
Hmm. Do you ever find yourself telling those stories out loud to your family, or is it always something that's in your own head that you keep to yourself until you start writing?
I'm pretty lucky that I'm married to a writer, and we both talk about our work, and there's a lot of fun moments where I'll tell her, oh, this is where I'm at in my head, but I can't figure out how to get from this point to the next point. And we just kind of talk about it a little bit. And she'll say, well, what if this happened? And I'll think, okay, yeah, let me try that. But having just somebody else to talk to and not feel like, they have to listen to me, like we like talking about it. And so, having those one, two, three people that you love, that will listen to you when you talk about your work. It's really meaningful to have that. I was a just I was a lonely kid in a lot of ways. I was really isolated, and reading was the way that I connected with the world. Reading the works of authors that I love, and then writing became this way for me to connect with people and find those people that meant something to me. So writing is the way for me to stay connected with the world.
Hmm. Wow. That's a great answer. So so we both have connections to Sewanee, Tennessee, which is, for those of you watching, is a very small town on a mountain in the countryside of Tennessee. The total population is about 2,000 people. And so we both know that Sewanee is a very small town that's blended with the university itself. It's a college town. So what aspects of being a writer in such a close-knit community do you believe positively contribute to your writing? And do you ever wish that you lived somewhere else that could maybe contribute to your writing differently, or are you perfectly happy being where you are?
Yeah. So I live in Swanee now, but I actually grew up in the valley just below in Winchester, Tennessee. So I worked for 2 years in the gender studies program at Harvard, and then for 2 years in the MFA program at Florida. Other than that, I've lived in the same county almost my entire life. And one of the things that I love about it is I've spent so much of my life here that I really feel connected to this place. I feel connected to the land, and I feel connected to the people who live here, not just the university and the people who are here for the university, but the people who live outside of the university. That's my family. And so there are all these times where I'm like, well, what would it be like if I lived in a city, or, we're closer to other people? But one of the great things about living in this very small place for so long is that I feel so closely connected to it that when I write about it or I imagine this place, I can see it so clearly. I know what it feels like. I know what the plants are. I know what the weather's like. It informs how I look at the world. And yeah, I wouldn't trade it. And also, I'm just such a nervous, anxious person that living in a small community can be really lovely, because I have space to be by myself, but there are people that know me and care about me, and are always there for me. So no, I wouldn't trade it. I love this place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is definitely a very special place, especially a place to grow up and to live. You really get to feel like a family with all the people who live there.
Yeah.
And so another question I have that's kind of Sewanee related, being a professor. Do you ever find that being a college professor and a writer influence each other? Or do you ever find yourself educating through your writing or using your writing skills or processes in your teaching? Do those two worlds for you kind of blend together?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, my primary job as a teacher, I teach creative writing at Swanee, and it's something that I genuinely love it. I mean, I'm so lucky for something like this, but in the real world, there's not many people that really want to sit and talk about short stories, like, so to every week be able to meet with these really intelligent, really thoughtful students who come from all these different walks of life, and we get to talk about writing, it's rejuvenating. And what's great about teaching is teaching forces me to constantly keep asking myself, why do I write this way, or why are stories told this way? Because I'm constantly meeting with new kids who have new questions, and I really have to keep asking myself questions that maybe if I was just a writer, I would just kind of get set in my ways and think this is the way it has to be. But my students keep me on my toes, and I and and I keep looking for new work to stay connected to those students. So it forces me to work harder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love it. Teaching is the thing that I really genuinely love doing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that your writing has grown or changed at all since you've been a teacher?
Yeah, I think because I talk about writing so much, it's forced me to think about what my own work does. And that's forced me to maybe try things that I wouldn't otherwise, because I just kind of want to see if it works or not, so that I can talk to my students about technique. I try to, and the other thing is, because my students come from so many different backgrounds, I try not to just teach one kind of story or one kind of novel. They come to me with all these different interests. So that forces me to think about my own work and not make it the same story every single time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so kind of to connect to working with younger people, In one of your other works, Wildfire Johnny, which is a short story from Baby, You're Gonna Be Mine, the main character finds a razor that allows him to travel back in time, which connects back to your blending of magic and fiction with reality. And so, if you could have this razor and travel back in time to meet your younger self, what would you tell yourself about writing, or what advice would you give to your younger self?
I mean, I think one of the things that I would tell my younger self was when I really decided I wanted to be a writer. I was maybe like 19 or 20, and I thought I want to see if I can do this. And I had really supportive parents and I had really supportive teachers. But I was 20 and I thought, I want to get a book. I want to write this. I want to, get published really soon. And that caused me a lot of grief. I think this worry, like, am I a real writer or not? Am I going to make it? And what I wish I could tell my younger self was that writing is a lifetime pursuit. It's something that you do for as long as you live if you really love it. And so it isn't this kind of race to immediately accomplish something. It's fun to like figure yourself out, to figure out how you write and get better at it. And that's, one of the things that writing has been so good for me is that writing really forces you to interrogate yourself, to ask yourself, what do I care about? What's meaningful to me? Who am I? And I think that if I'd slowed that down a little bit more, I wouldn't have been quite so stressed out and could just enjoy it. Oh, let me turn this light on so it's not quite so dark. Well, it's not coming on. Hold on. Okay. But then the other thing is that I would tell my younger self too, is just never let someone dictate what is and isn't literature. And I was really lucky that my parents let me read anything. And I loved comic books and I loved fairy tales and I loved literature. But I think that's made me a better writer, to just be open to any kind of literature as it comes to me. And I would tell my younger self, you can't really succeed as a writer unless you know kind of what other people are doing, and to read as widely as you can, to try to discover all that's out there. And like I said, I think reading saved me in so many ways. I was such an isolated, anxious kid, and books were this kind of flare that the author sent up into the air, and I could see it, and I could see myself in that work, and I could feel connected to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'd limited myself to one kind of story or one kind of genre, if I would have had that feeling of connectedness quite as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So since you write fiction writing, my next question is, nowadays we live in a world where everything is painfully real. With coronavirus, with all of the things happening in America and the wider world, it can feel like there's no escape from the difficult times that we're living in. And since you use books as an escape from your world growing up, and you offer that as an escape to people through your own writing, and I know that for myself, fiction books and short stories can also be an escape from the world that I live in, and probably for many others. What do you believe is the importance of fiction writing, and why did you choose to write this as opposed to a different genre?
Well, I mean, so the larger thing is, like, I think about this a lot, like, what's the meaning of writing in the world that we live in? What does it offer? What does it do? And I think, except there are rare cases where I think a work of literature can actively create change, right? To actually change the world as we know it. And that's really wonderful, but that's not what most works of literature do. But what I think is that literature, for me, it makes living tolerable. It makes it possible. It makes me understand how connected I am to the world. And I get this a lot. Like, a lot of my students sometimes are like, why are so many of the stories that we read sad? Like, why aren't they happy? But, like, looking at the world that we live in, there's a lot of pain, right? And so for me, reading sadness, reading stories that have loss or grief, it allows me to not feel alone in my own grief. It allows me to understand that I'm not alone when I'm in pain, that other people have experienced this and survived it. And so for reading, for me, in that way, lets me feel connected to the kind of common source of pain and survival that it means to be human. And that's what literature does for me. And that's what I want to do. Like I talked earlier about, you send that little flare out, the writer does, and somebody sees it, maybe far, far away. Like, no, what author would think of me in Winchester, Tennessee, seeing their book, seeing that flare shot up into the sky? So when I write, that's what I'm trying to do, is just send that flare up. And I'm not trying to get famous or make a ton of money. I just want to maybe somebody see it and feel connected in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think the world that we live in now, especially with coronavirus, where there's this necessary distance that must take place, right? We have to keep a distance from people so that we can protect each other. Literature becomes this way to bring me closer to people, right? It's the way. I have a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old, and when we read books together, it's that moment where my son and I are in bed together and we're connected. There are characters in the world that's been created and we're connected to them. And then there's the author that made them and we're connected to them. And little by little, these threads of connection are going to keep us from sinking below the surface. It's going to be the thing that allows us to stay afloat so that we can then do the things necessary to change the world, to make it a better place.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really beautiful answer. Okay. And I think that you're speaking to the importance of reading stories of pain and hardship is what constitutes quality literature, is writing about the human experience and exposing those parts that everyone lives, whether they want to acknowledge that or face that or not. Everyone has hardship in their lives. And I think that the ability to write or read about those things is really a special thing. And so I just have one more question before we move on to the Q&A. So to everyone watching, if you have any questions, go ahead and send those in and we'll get to those soon. So my last question before we move on is, how do you distinguish yourself from other writers and create work that's different? And what advice do you have to young people who are writing, who write for fun, like you said, or who have dreams of becoming great writers? And so what's your advice to them about distinguishing themselves and creating something that's unique and different?
So, yeah, so the kind of advice first is just two things. And one is, like, when I was an undergrad in college and when I was in grad school, I was never the best writer. I just, and I wasn't, that didn't make me upset. I just wasn't, but what I knew was that once I knew that I wanted to do this, I wasn't going to stop. Right. And I think that just my makeup, because of where I came from and how, I lived my life, like struggling so much with my own brain, I wasn't going to let rejection stop me. And when I got rejection, I just ate it and moved on. I just knew that I was going to try to outlast every single person and keep making work. And at the end of the day, there were a lot of people better than me, but they found other things that they loved, or they decided writing wasn't for them, or it was maybe more difficult than they wanted it to be. And that was fine, but I just knew I wasn't going to stop, And so I say that, like, and I think this for young people can sound a little fanciful, like, don't give up. Because what I also have to admit is that it was just sheer luck in some ways. Like, I met people who cared about me, who helped me develop my work. And if I hadn't met them, maybe that wouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. But you can't plan for luck. Like, I can't plan for the random weird things that, like, meeting Nicole Kidman. Like, you can't plan for that. All you can plan for is not stopping, right? Of just saying, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it for as long as I possibly can. And then you hope that luck will enter into the equation, but it won't come unless you're just tirelessly making sure that you're pushing forward. Mm-hmm. And if you love it, it's not that hard. Like, even when I was bad at writing, it was fun. So what was the problem? I knew I would eventually, hopefully, get better. And then what was the first part of the question? I'm sorry. What was the, how to make myself,
how to distinguish yourself.
So this is the thing too. Like, I love so many writers, and that, like, Carson McCullers Amy Bender, George Saunders. And in a lot of ways, when I first started writing, I just copied them. I just wanted to write like they wrote. And what's kind of wonderful about imitating the writers that you love is that eventually your own limitations as a writer, like you can't do certain things the way they do it, but you can do other things differently. Your style starts to develop. And so I really kind of loved imitating until I figured out, oh, this is what I do. This is how I write. And so that's kind of how I distinguished myself, was first just copying them until I figured out who I was and what I wanted to write. And if you look at a lot of my early stories, you can be like, oh, that's an Amy Bender story, but Kevin's trying to write it. Or that's a George Saunders story. And that's cool. That's how I learned. That's how I figured out who I was.
Yeah. Good answer. All right. So I think now we can move on to the Q&A. The first question is, have your stories helped you cope with Tourette's, and is writing cathartic for you?
I think so. I mean, I'm definitely, thanks to therapy and medicine, I feel like I'm much more in control of myself. But when I was quite young, my body was just out of control. I had agitation inside of me and these weird thoughts in my head, and I felt alien or freakish, and writing was this place where I could take that stuff and put it on the page. And once it was on the page, I could touch it, I could hold it, and it relieved the tension in my brain. And I could actually play around with the story and make it go the way that I wanted to. So for me, for my mental health, writing is really important. It allows me to kind of take that stuff that's inside of me and just make it external for a little while. So yeah, it was a huge help. It's what saved me.
Mm-hmm. Do you still find that it has that ability to help you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of why I still write is because it still helps me figure out who I am and how I tell stories. And those, like those kids that catch on fire, that's been in my brain since I was 10 years old. So I'm still figuring out how to work with that stuff.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think that's relatable, that great writing comes from real experiences and true emotions, because if you just make something up, you pull it out of thin air, it's not going to be true to yourself and true to the experience of the characters, unless there's some truth to it in your own life.
Yeah, even if it's just a tiny kernel, like just some part of yourself that you can see on the page, I think it makes you invest in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Okay, so our second question is, your ties to Tennessee are clearly strong, Sewanee and Winchester. Have you ever felt that being an author from the American South, which is perhaps looked down upon by the artistic elite in northern circles, has made your career more difficult?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, one of the kind of lovely things about being a Southern writer is that there's this entire community built around Southern writers, and a real affection for, when you think of Carson McCullers, Flannery O'Connor, Fannie Flagg, Faulkner, Dorothy Allison, like there's a huge lineage of incredible work that came out of the South. And so I haven't felt limited by it. But the other thing is, I would say, is a lot of my work isn't maybe typically Southern in the way people expect. And so I'm slightly outside of it. Like I write about being rural, but not rural in the way that like being a farmer, I grew up in a rural town, but we had a Walmart. So I'm Southern in some ways and maybe not Southern in other ways, but I don't think it's affected me. And my son was talking about this because we've been talking a lot about what it means to be Southern in light of what's happening in our country right now. And, the South is haunted by the things that have happened in the past. And there's no way to truly live that down. We come from that same provenance of pain. And so he was like, why should I be proud to be Southern? And what I could point him to was, one, like just basic things, like the American Civil Rights Movement originates from the South, and if you think about music, the music that I love is rap and also rhythm and blues. And thinking about music culture is so directly influenced by the South. And then thinking about literature, art, all the things that have come out of the American South, these are the things that we can hold on to, that despite all of those kind of horrible, awful things that continue to happen and have happened in the South, there's this incredible body of beautiful things that have come out of this place too. And so I don't know if it's proud to be Southern, but I acknowledge that being from Tennessee affected the kind of person that I was.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely understand that because I'm also from Tennessee, born and raised. And I was talking about this with my dad today, that despite all of the terrible things that have happened in the South, there is definitely a very rich culture and artistic culture here that isn't what everyone else believes that it is, and that it actually really is a beautiful, special place. Even with all of its demons and dark sides, there is a light side to that. Um, okay, so moving on. Of everything that you have written, are you compelled to see a pathway for sequels? And then another question onto that, it's a two-part question, is do authors come up with their own fiction, or do you seek others to collaborate?
Oh, that's great. So one thing really about the idea of collaboration is that when I was in high school, I loved movies. Like we had this action video, and they had just the weirdest old movies from the 70s and 60s, just strange stuff, and I loved it. And I was like, oh, I'd love to make movies, you know. But I lived in Winchester, Tennessee. I didn't have money for a camera. How was I going to make a movie? And so I moved to writing fiction because it was something I could make on my own. And so that was kind of what became lovely about it, was that it was mine and just mine, right? It was what came out of my head and my heart. I love the idea of collaboration, but for me, it is a really intensely personal thing. But so much of that was just because I was lonely and isolated. There wasn't anyone to make stuff with,
Hmm.
so I just kind of fell into it. And then for sequels, it's weird because I think about my characters a lot because their story ends, but they didn't die, you know, they keep living. And so there are moments where I'm like, what would it be like a year from now, 2 years from now, when they're 50? And it's fun to imagine them. And it's weird with this novel, Nothing to See Here in particular. People have asked me, like, would you write a sequel to it? And one of the things is, it ends in a way where I felt like there's a moment of grace for those characters, and I really love those characters. And if I were to write a sequel, I would have to think up some new conflict, some danger to put them in, and that's hard for me to think about. I like leaving them in this place. I know their life won't be perfect and things will happen, but it was a nice moment to leave them somewhere better than when they started.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the ending of Nothing to See Here, when I finished it, I was like, oh, I kind of wish I could know what happens to Lillian and the kids. But as I thought about it, I was like, well, I like that he ended it this way because it's so open that anything could really happen, and you know that they're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have another Nothing to See Here related question. It is, if Nothing to See Here is made into a movie, who do you see starring in it?
Oh, that's so crazy. Because it's been I sold the rights pretty quickly after the book came out to a woman, Elizabeth Gabler at Sony, and the screenwriters have written. It's the same screenwriters who have done all the John Green adaptations, like The Fault in Our Stars, and so they're really great at taking books and turning them into screenplays. And I don't know. I think because of the state of the world, it's hard to imagine, you know, when this might actually even move forward. Um, but one person that got mentioned early on, not that she would do it, just as someone that might be a cool person,
Mhm.
was for Lillian was Emma Stone,
Oh, wow.
an actress that I really love, and she's kind of sarcastic and funny, and I could see her in my head. And then at one point in that got mentioned, somebody was like, I think of Madison, the other main character, as someone like Margot Robbie, I think her name is, who's
Mhm.
like Harley Quinn. That was kind of, you know, and you hear all this stuff, but you never know what happens or if it will ever happen. To my mind, whoever they pick will be such a cool surprise that I'll be happy with.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, do you think that the people who ended up playing the characters in The Family Fang were who you wanted them to be?
Well, it was weird because in the book, they're much younger than the characters are in the movie. And that was partly just because Nicole and Jason wanted to play those parts. So we aged them. So it wasn't how I imagined them, but it was just I went to the Toronto Film Festival where it premiered with my wife, and I was sitting next to Christopher Walken and Jason Bateman, and I could see them on the screen. And just, I think that's one of the gifts of being an actor, is you can embody a character in such a way that now when I think of Annie and Buster Fang, I see them, it's just so clear in my head that they were perfect for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. Someone says, you may have already answered this as I joined late, but if you haven't, I'm very interested to hear about the Batman figures in the background. Why do you like Batman?
Oh, yeah, so these are my little Batman statues. So one thing is I just have loved comic books since I was a kid, and I loved Batman. I loved that he didn't have superpowers. I loved that he was a kind of just a detective, really, and that was cool to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and I loved the way different artists represented him. So he looked different so many different times because of how he was drawn. But the main thing was just these statues came out, and my wife and kids started buying them for me because it was an easy thing to shop for. So every year I get like 2 Batman statues, and my wife was like, I don't really want them in the house. So I put them in my office at work and they're all lined up. And the one good thing that comes out of it is when I have a young student come in who's maybe nervous or weirded out because they're in college for the first time, they come to see me and they see all these Batman statues and they kind of understand that I'm not like scary, I'm just kind
Yeah.
of silly. And it's just a nice way for them. And I've actually, some of my students that I'm still friends with, the way that we connected was they just like looking at the Batman statues. So it's just something about comic books were so meaningful and important to me. These kind of magical worlds where people had powers, and it was the first way that I kind of understood how stories were told. And I don't know, I just keep coming back to them.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. So the Decameron Project does some work with English teachers in schools and stuff. And so I think we have an English teacher watching now who asks, how have your English teachers influenced your writing?
Yeah, so I grew up like I said, in Winchester, Tennessee. I went to a really big kind of rural public high school. And so I just kind of disappeared. I wasn't, and also just because of how isolated I was. But my English teachers were the first people that were like, because it was hard for me to talk in public, they were the first people that were like, on the page, you have a confidence, like you can arrange the words in a way that makes sense. And that was really helpful. It was small and tiny, and it wasn't like I was a great student. It was just a kindness that those teachers gave me. And then when I got to college, I went to Vanderbilt in Nashville, and my professor was Tony Early, who's still there. And Tony was the first person that read a short story of mine. And I don't think he thinks about it probably, but it was just this moment where he took me aside and he was like, if you want to do this, you can. I think that you could. And I don't think he understood how just that small moment of permission opened me up. It made me believe that I can try this, And that's the one thing with my students. I know that not all of them are going to go on to do writing because they're so talented and they have so many interests. And as they get older, it may change. But I always try to say in that moment, like, if you want to do this, you can, right? And I'll help you. I'll do whatever you want to help get you to that next step. And for me, that's what a teacher is for, right? I mean, you want to teach, right? You want to impart knowledge, but some of the real power of being a teacher is telling a student that they can do it, is acknowledging the things that they're already doing and making them appreciate what they can do already. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for that one moment when Tony Early said, if you want to, you can do this. I know it, I wouldn't have become one.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a really great story and some great advice for our English teachers who may be listening. So our last question in the Q&A is, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer? Which you kind of answered this, but also, like, were there times before your teacher, Tony Early, pulled you aside that you kind of thought about it?
Yeah, so in high school, I started writing like on my own. And I come, like I said, a really rural background, and I remember I was mowing the grass, and I showed my dad one of my stories, and after I'd mowed the grass, he came out and we sat on the truck where I was loading the lawnmower back up, and he said, this is good. I like this. And I remember telling him, I think this is kind of what I'd like to try to do. And just having my parents say, okay, that was the moment when I knew, when I told my dad I want to be a writer, it felt meaningful. Like I was finally saying it out loud to somebody else. And I was, I don't know, 18, 17. And I was like, I think I want to be a writer. And I often think about what would have happened. Like, again, like my teacher, if my dad had said, that's a terrible idea, what would have happened to me? So much of my life is the luck of being surrounded by people who cared about me and helped me believe that I could do the thing that came next. And as a teacher, that's what I want to be here for, is that moment when a student tells me that thing that they want. I want there to be somebody there to tell them, you should go do it. I want you to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's when I knew I wanted to be one, when I said it out loud.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for this great conversation, Kevin. I've really learned a lot from you, and I think that those of us watching, the people in the crowd, have also learned a lot about how important it is to stay true to yourself and not be afraid to be creative in your writing, and to even incorporate parts of yourself in your own life in your writing. So if you're watching and you took anything from Kevin's talk, which I know I did, feel free to cook something up and submit it to the Decameron Project. As always, we'd love to read some of your stories. And thank you again, Kevin, so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Ward, these were some of the most thoughtful questions, and a really genuinely just a wonderful conversation with you. So thank you for taking the time. And thanks to anyone who watched. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks. You too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.